Nepal is a country where the world rises almost vertically. In the humid Terai Plains, the land can sit at around 60 meters above sea level. Then within the same national border, it rockets to 8,148, 86 meters at the summit of Mount Everest. And that breathtaking height is not finished. The Himalaya exists because continents are still colliding pressure that builds beauty, but also danger. On April 25, 2015, a 7.8 earthquake reminded everyone that this landscape can change in less than a minute. So what kind of civilization grows in a place where the ground is alive, where rivers, mountains, and memory never stop moving? Nepal's landscape does not feel arranged. It feels pressed, as if the planet folded itself here and never fully relaxed. The Himalaya exists because the Indian and Eurasian plates collided, creating one of Earth's highest mountain belts. The force behind that collision is not a story of the past. It is an active engine that keeps reshaping slopes, valleys, and fault lines. That is why Nepal can hold such extreme vertical contrast inside a relatively small footprint. In the south, the country drops into the Terai, low, warm, and heavy with summer humidity. In the north, the land leaps into the Great Himalayan Wall, where snowfields, ice falls, and thin air turn distance into an illusion. Even Nepal's elevation range tells the tale like a single sharp sentence from around 60 meters above sea level to 8,848.886 meters at Mount Everest. But the real drama is not just height. It is how that height is made and what it costs. The pressure of plate convergence is stored along major structures like the main Himalayan thrust, a vast fault system that can lock for long periods, quietly accumulating strain, then release it in destructive pulses. Earthquakes are not an interruption to Nepal's story. They are part of its grammar. When the ground shifts, it rearranges rivers, triggers landslides, and rewrites the boundaries between safe and sudden. The surface geography carries clear fingerprints of this restless architecture. Nepal's mountains are young in geological terms, steep, sharp, prone to fracture, so gravity is always waiting for a moment of weakness. Add the seasonal rhythm of the South Asian monsoon, and the country becomes a place where water behaves like a sculptor with unlimited time. Rain does not merely fall, it excavates. It saturates hillsides, loads rivers with sediment, and sends whole sections of road or terrace sliding downhill when the rock and soil can no longer hold. In the monsoon months, cloud becomes a ceiling, and valleys feel like corridors for wind and water, not just scenic routes. And then there are the rivers, Nepal's moving veins. The country feeds some of the great Himalayan drainage systems, cutting pathways from ice and snow toward the plains. High in the north, meltwater begins as a quiet thread. It becomes a roar as tributaries meet, carving deeper channels through brittle rock, rushing past villages that learned long ago to build with the expectation that the mountain might someday reclaim the slope. Even when the sky is clear, many of these rivers run with a pale mineral haze, stone ground into flour by glaciers, and carried downstream like a signature. Nowhere is Nepal's geological memory more haunting than in the Kathmandu Valley. At first glance, it looks like a natural amphitheater hills, rising on all sides, a broad floor, in the middle, a city spreading outward like an ink stain. But research on the valley's geomorphology and sediments points to a deeper origin. For long stretches of the late Pleistocene, the basin held an ancient lake, and its drainage history helped shape the valley's present form. When that lake began to drain, linked to river incision and evolving outlets, the valley's flatlands and layered deposits became the stage on which later kingdoms' temples and daily life could take root. In other words, Kathmandu's cultural center sits on top of a landscape that was once water, then became earth, and is still adjusting to both. Farther north, the high Himalaya delivers the iconic images, ridgelines like broken glass glaciers, wedged into shadowed bowls, prayer flags snapping in wind that seems to come from the curvature of the planet itself. Everest's height, jointly announced by Nepal and China in 2020 as 8,948, 86 meters, is not only a measurement, it is a reminder that even the top of the world is under negotiation between rock ice and tectonic uplift. And across the middle hills, the mid-mountain belt, Nepal becomes a mosaic of terraces, forests, and ridges. This is where elevation creates microclimates. One slope may be damp and green, another dry and bright, depending on sun exposure and wind. It is also where geology turns personal. A ridgeline can decide which village receives water in spring. A landslide scar can reshape a family's future overnight. A fault deep beneath the surface can determine how houses are built, how roads are planned, and how communities recover after shaking. So, Nepal's natural setting is not a background. It is a living system, uplift, building, mountains, rivers, cutting them down, monsoon rain, accelerating the work, and earthquakes resetting the balance without warning. And with that in mind, one question begins to feel unavoidable if the ground itself is still in motion. What does it mean to call any place home? In Nepal, biodiversity is not arranged in wide horizontal bands. It climbs. In a single day of travel, ecosystems can shift the way a film changes genres, tropical humidity giving way to temperate forests, then to alpine grasslands, and finally to a world where almost nothing grows except lichen-stubborn moss and the memory of summer. Nepal's ecological richness is often explained by this altitudinal variation, which allows a small country to hold multiple biomes and a mosaic of habitats compressed into tight distances. National biodiversity reporting describes 6 biomes, 35 forest types, and 118 ecosystems shaped by climate and elevation. Start in the south, in the Terai lowland heat. Wide rivers, tall grasses that can hide an entire animal until it decides to move. Here, life often survives by blending into the green. In places like Chitwan National Park, the forest and floodplain still support one of the last strongholds of the single-horned Asiatic rhinoceros, and the park remains a refuge for the Bengal tiger. At dawn, mist can float above the river like thin gauze. Birds stitch across the sky in quick, nervous lines. Then somewhere in the grass, a heavy breath becomes audible, an animal so large it seems impossible that it can vanish so completely. The Terai teaches a quiet lesson in Nepal. Power does not always live at the top of the mountains. But Nepal's biodiversity story becomes even more dramatic as the land rises into the middle hills. The air cools, forests thicken. This is the realm of broadleaf trees, pines. And when spring arrives, hillsides that flash with rhododendron, Nepal's beloved national flower, known as lali gurans. Color here is not decoration. It is a seasonal announcement, a signal to insects, birds, and people that a world is turning again. The soundscape changes to fewer insects, more wind through needles, the distant knock of woodpeckers, the low murmur of streams working patiently downhill. Higher still, the ecology begins to look like endurance. In the high Himalaya, the living world becomes sparse, but never empty. Sagarmatha National Park, recognized by UNESCO, is not only about superlative scenery. It is also habitat for rare species, including the snow leopard and the red panda animals that feel almost mythic because they are so elusive, so adapted to places humans can barely breathe. In these altitudes, survival is a discipline. Winters can last most of the year. Food chains are shorter, and every calorie matters. A predator may travel huge distances on ridgelines, using cliffs as cover and wind as camouflage. A small mammal may live in the architecture of rock, emerging only when the sun briefly softens the cold. Between these extremes, Terai to Himalaya, Nepal's ecosystems form a vertical corridor that supports not just iconic species, but relationships. In the trans-Himalayan rain shadow regions and high alpine zones, the snow leopard is often linked to prey like the blue sheep, barrel a species studied in Nepal's high mountains for its role in supporting large predators. This is where ecology becomes a story of balanced prey. Animals scanning slopes, predators reading terrain, and human communities sharing the same space, often with different definitions of risk and need. Nepal's protected landscapes are also laboratories of conservation. In the lowlands, rivers thread through parks and buffer zones, carrying not just water, but entire micro-worlds, fish, insects, birds, and reptiles that depend on healthy flow and clean banks. Chitwan in particular is tied to a long-running effort that feels almost cinematic in its specificity. The Gharial Breeding Center, established in 1978 at Kasara to protect and rebuild populations of the endangered fish-eating gharial crocodile. The program has released large numbers of gharials into major Nepali rivers over decades, trying to restore what the wild can no longer recover alone. It is a reminder that biodiversity is not only about protecting what is still abundant, but about refusing to accept the disappearance of what is rare. And then there is the sky. Nepal has become a symbol of one of the most dramatic bird conservation stories in South Asia, the fight to bring back vultures. Across the region, vulture numbers collapsed in the 1990s and 2000s, due largely to veterinary drugs like diclofenac contaminating livestock, carcasses, an ecological disaster that removed nature's cleanup crew and triggered cascading problems. Nepal's response included community-based protection and the creation of vulture safe zones, including a major milestone in 2021 when a zone was declared truly safe after monitoring drug threats and survival rates. Suddenly, the biodiversity story is not only about animals. It is about medicine policy farmers and the fragile chain of decisions that can either poison a landscape or heal it. So what does it mean in a country like Nepal for a single choice to echo through an ecosystem? What happens when a drug used to treat cattle ends up deciding the fate of a bird that never touches a living animal? Seen from far away, Nepal's biodiversity might look like a list species, names park boundaries, threat categories. But the lived reality is sensory. It is the weight of humidity in Chitwan before a storm breaks. It is the sudden silence when a tiger's presence is suspected but not confirmed. It is the sharp scent of pine in the middle hills and the bright shock of rhododendron against gray rock. And in Sagarmatha, it is wind so cold it feels metallic, moving across glaciers and ridge lines, where life exists at the edge of possibility. This vertical ecology also shapes a deeper truth. Biodiversity here is not a separate nature away from people. Many ecosystems are interwoven with trails grazing routes, sacred forests, river crossings, and seasonal rhythms. The same mountains that hold rare species also guide human movement. The same rivers that support crocodiles and birds also feed farms downstream. The same forests that shelter red panda and other wildlife are also living resources for nearby communities. That is why Nepal's biodiversity feels like a question the country keeps asking quietly, persistently, at every elevation. How much can be taken before a landscape stops giving back? And when a species returns from the brink, what exactly is coming back? An animal or an entire missing function of the world? The camera can linger on a footprint in wet sand or on prayer flags snapping above a tree line. In Nepal, both scenes belong to the same ecological story, one written in fur feather leaf and snow and revised every season. Before Nepal becomes a nation of temples and trekking routes, it is something older and quieter, a corridor. A narrow strip of earth where the warm Indo-Gangetic plains press up against the cold high logic of the Himalaya. For tens of thousands of years, long before anyone named these ridges movement, through this terrain would have been shaped by the same forces that still govern life today. Water altitude season, and the simple question of what the body can endure. Archaeologists have long noted that Nepal's earliest human story is difficult to pin down into neat cities and dates. Much of the evidence is scattered across river terraces, foothills, and shifting landscapes, especially along the Siwalik Range and the southern belt, where stone tools and surface finds suggest very early human activity, even if definitive settlement sequences remain unevenly documented. That uncertainty matters because it fits Nepal's character, a place where the ground moves rivers, reroute, and even the past can be buried or exposed by one season of rain. Yet the larger pattern is clear. Nepal's geography invites a certain kind of human intelligence, an ability to read slopes, to store food against weather, to build paths where no path wants to exist. In the lowlands, communities could live with abundance and heat, growing crops on flatter ground and following rivers that braided through forests. In the hills, people learned the discipline of terraces, turning steepness into steps and steps into survival. And higher still, human life became a negotiation with thin air, not conquest, but adaptation. Then gradually, Nepal's human story begins to leave stronger signatures, not only in soil, but in sacred memory. In the southern plains, Lumbini stands as one of the most powerful anchors. UNESCO describes Lumbini as the sacred area where the Buddha was born in 623 BC, marked by the Asoka Pillar inscription dating to 249 BC, linking Nepal's Terai to a spiritual geography that would stretch across Asia for centuries. It is a profound contrast, a birthplace associated with global Buddhist pilgrimage, set not in the high Himalaya, but in the low warm Terai, where the air is heavy and the horizon feels wide. Nepal's cultural identity begins to look less like a single mountain silhouette and more like a bridge between worlds. Move north into the Kathmandu Valley, and the tone changes again. This valley is not just a basin surrounded by hills. It is a cultural engine that turned geography into art. UNESCO's Kathmandu Valley listing identifies 7 monument zones: the Durbar squares of Kathmandu, Hanuman Doka Patan, and Bhaktapur, the Buddhist stupas of Swayambhu and Baudhanath, and the Hindu temples of Pashupati and Changu Narayan, together illustrating the valley's historic and artistic achievements. Even without naming every dynasty, the message is unmistakable. Here belief was built into wood and brick, hammered into bronze, carved into doorways, and arranged into courtyards that held daily life. This is also where Nepal's famous religious coexistence becomes something tangible rather than theoretical. In the valley, Hindu and Buddhist sacred spaces do not merely exist near each other. They overlap in the rhythm of festivals, the shared streets, the everyday gestures of devotion. Many accounts of Newar civilization emphasize precisely this interwoven religious landscape, where traditions are not always separated into clean categories, but lived side by side in the same neighborhoods and calendars. So a deeper question emerges in a place where mountains tower like walls. Why does the heart of Nepal's heritage sit in a valley where people gathered, traded, argued, celebrated, and turned survival into a sophisticated urban culture? Beyond the valley, Nepal's early cultural map widens into many identities shaped by altitude and border. In the high Himalaya near Everest, the Sherpa story becomes central, not as a modern tourism stereotype, but as a community with its own lineage migration memory and mountain knowledge. Sources describing Sherpa history commonly trace roots to Tibetan regions and emphasize settlement in the Khumbu and Solu areas near Everest, where mountain life demanded a particular kind of endurance and social cohesion. In these elevations, culture often functions like equipment. It keeps people alive. Rituals and monasteries do more than preserve belief, they hold community. Seasonal movement aligns with weather. Stories teach respect for terrain that can kill without anger, without intention. And between Nepal's southern plains and northern heights, trade routes help braid cultures together. For centuries, goods and ideas moved through Himalayan corridors, connecting Tibet, the Middle Hills, and onward to India, a commerce that was never only economic. It carried languages, artistic motifs, religious texts, marriage ties, and political influence. Accounts of trans-Himalayan exchange describe ancient salt trade routes linking the Tibetan plateau to Nepal and beyond, and historical analyses note Kathmandu's role as a key entrepot during periods when these routes flourished. Caravans crossing high passes were not simply transporting salt and wool. They were transporting connection proof that even in the world's highest terrain, isolation is rarely complete. This helps explain why Nepal's early culture can feel simultaneously local and expansive. A carved window in Patan might reflect a valleycraft tradition, but the iconography can echo broader Himalayan Buddhism. A temple courtyard might be rooted in Newar urban life, yet its festivals can attract pilgrims whose journeys began far beyond Nepal's borders. A mountain community might hold a fierce sense of independence while still living within a spiritual universe shared across the plateau. And always beneath these cultural layers, the landscape speaks. Rivers become routes. Ridges become borders. Forests become both shelter and threat. Mountains become more than stone. They become moral presences, sacred, feared, respected, negotiated with. So when people ask, who lived here first? Nepal answers in a way that is less like a single name and more like a moving panorama, foothill toolmakers whose traces are hard to hold. Lowland sacred sites that tie Nepal to the great currents of Asian history. Valley civilizations that built dense urban artistry. Mountain communities that learned to live with altitude as a permanent teacher. And traders whose footsteps stitched the Himalaya into a living network. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: in Nepal, culture often looks like a response to motion of plates of rivers, of caravans, of pilgrims, of seasons of memory. If the land itself never truly stops changing, what kind of traditions survive rigid ones, or those flexible enough to travel with the ground beneath them? For centuries, Nepal's exploration did not always look like a foreign flag planted on a summit. Often, it looked like something more intimate: artisans mapping the divine into wood, and brick traders threading high passes with salt, and wool kings turning valleys into civic theaters, and armies learning how to move like water through hills. In the Kathmandu Valley, the Mala period is often remembered as a long, intricate bloom, an era when courtly competition helped fuel extraordinary artistry. Multiple sources describe how the Mala rulers shaped the valley's urban form and temple culture, leaving behind palace complexes, courtyards, and the architectural language that still defines Kathmandu Patan and Bhaktapur's historic cores. The result was a landscape where the city itself became a kind of scripture-carved struts, holding deities above doorways, brick pagodas rising like layered prayers, and public squares designed not only for power, but for festivals, processions, and daily life. But Nepal's history is not a straight line of aesthetic glory. It is also a story of fractured polities, small hill states, and competing valley kingdoms, until one mountain kingdom began to imagine something larger. In the mid-18th century, Prithvi Narayan Shah, king of Gorkha, moved with a patient strategy, isolate, blockade, and then absorb. Britannica notes that he became king in 1742 and expanded his territory by conquering surrounding principalities. He also established Kathmandu as the capital after bringing the valley under his control. If the Malla era felt like culture becoming architecture, the Shah unification felt like geography becoming policy. The Himalaya, not just as a barrier, but as a shield. The valley, not just as a cultural heart, but as a political center. This shift matters because it reframes Nepal as more than a crossroads. It becomes a buffer state, a space between empires, between the Tibetan Plateau and the Indo-Gangetic Plains, between expanding colonial power and mountain sovereignty. And once Nepal existed as a more unified kingdom, it faced a question that would define the next century. How does a small country survive when larger powers begin to measure land not by sacred meaning, but by strategic distance? The answer for a time was written in war. The Anglo-Nepalese War, 1814-1816, also called the Gorkha War, broke out between the Kingdom of Nepal and the British East India Company. It ended with the Treaty of Sugauli Britannica, spells it Sagauli, signed on March 4, 1816, which forced Nepal to renounce claims to disputed lowland territories and to cede lands west of the Kali River, extending toward the Sutlej. The treaty was a wound, but also a boundary line that helped Nepal remain Nepal, a country pressured into contraction, yet not swallowed. And out of that conflict came one of history's strangest transformations, admiration becoming recruitment. Accounts from the Gurkha Museum and the Gurkha Welfare Trust describe how British officers impressed by Gurkha soldiers' fighting qualities began recruiting Gurkhas into British service as early as 1815, even before the war formally ended. It's a paradox that fits Nepal. A war that cost territory also produced a global military reputation, one that would shape livelihoods, migration, and identity for generations. Yet even while Nepal navigated foreign pressure, the greatest power struggles were often internal. In 1846, a palace massacre, the Khat episode, became a turning point that opened the long period known as the Rana era, 1846-1951. Britannica describes this era as a time when control of government lay in the hands of the Rana family. Jung Bahadur seized power in 1846, made himself permanent prime minister, and established hereditary Rana dominance that lasted until 1951. Under the Ranas, Nepal maintained relations with the British, receiving support that helped preserve the regime's stability. Yet the cost was a kind of political freezing, where the Shah monarch became largely ceremonial and power concentrated in a tight circle. So Nepal's development in this era can feel double-edged. On one side, the state survives, avoids full colonization, and carefully manages foreign relations. On the other, the country's internal modernization and political openness were constrained by an oligarchic structure. What does progress mean in a mountain kingdom, when stability can also be a form of silence? Then, in the 20th century, a new kind of exploration began to redefine Nepal's global image mountaineering. If the 19th century was about borders drawn by treaties and family rule, the mid-20th century was about borders drawn in the sky-high ridgelines, becoming a stage where human endurance met altitude's indifference. In 1950, the French Annapurna expedition, led by Maurice Herzog, achieved the first ascent of an 8,000-meter peak summiting Annapurna, or 8 Zunainimen, on June 3, 1950, a milestone often described as the first successful climb of any 8,000er. The story is famous not only because of the summit, but because of the cost, the brutal descent, the frostbite, the thin line between heroism and tragedy. And then came the moment that turned Nepal into a symbol recognized everywhere: Mount Everest. Britannica's account of the 1953 expedition records the decisive push on May 29th, when Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay climbed from the south summit to the top, transforming Everest from a remote extreme into a shared human reference point. What changed after that was not only Nepal's tourism potential, it was the world's imagination. Nepal became synonymous with highest, hardest, purest, and that myth, once born, was impossible to control. But Nepal's historical development is not only Everest headlines. It is also the rise of places that became gateways. Kathmandu remained the political and cultural heart, layered with centuries of temple squares and royal complexes shaped across dynasties. Yet towns like Pokhara grew into a different role, a soft frontier at the edge of the Annapurna region, a place where the mountains look close enough to touch, where trekking culture and local life intersect, where the modern economy of journeys takes form. In this way, Nepal's exploration story becomes a mirror. The country is explored by outsiders, yes, but it is also continuously rediscovered by Nepal itself as it negotiates what to share, what to protect, and what to become. By the time the Rana era ended in 1951, Nepal was standing at the threshold of a new chapter, more exposed to regional politics after the British withdrawal from India, and more visible to the world as mountaineering and travel brought international attention. Britannica notes that the post-1947 environment created new pressures that the Rana system could not fully contain. From here, development would increasingly mean road schools, tourism, and national identity debates, yet always under the shadow of geography. Because Nepal's history does not happen on a flat map, every political shift is filtered through terrain. Armies move differently in hills. Markets emerge where passes allow. Capitals matter because valleys allow density. And global fascination often fixes on the peaks. But the country's true continuity is in the middle spaces, the ridges, the rivers, the towns that live between snowline and jungle. So, when the camera pulls back, Nepal's historical arc can be felt as a sequence of transformations. Valley kingdoms refining a golden urban culture. A mountain king unifying fractured states and shifting the capital into Kathmandu's orbit. A war that shrank territory but forged a military reputation recognized far beyond Nepal's borders. A century of Rana dominance that preserved sovereignty while tightening politics. And finally, the high-altitude age, Annapurna and Everest, turning Nepal into a global symbol of extremes. Yet one question keeps returning sharper each time the story climbs higher. When the world comes to Nepal, chasing summits, what parts of Nepal's deeper history, its valleys, its treaties, its quiet centuries, do they never notice? Modern Nepal lives with two clocks ticking at once. One is the everyday rhythm markets, opening school bells, motorbikes weaving through Kathmandu's narrow streets, incense drifting from doorways. The other is geological time louder than it should be because it occasionally breaks into the present without warning. On April 25, 2015, that second clock struck hard. The 7.8 magnitude Gorkha earthquake tore through the country, killing thousands and injuring many more, damaging homes, roads, and historic structures. A decade later, the earthquake is still not only a memory, it is a policy question. Reconstruction has moved forward unevenly, with major progress in many rebuilt homes and public facilities, yet lingering challenges in dense urban areas where land disputes, Ownership, complexity, and engineering constraints slow the work. And nowhere is that tension more visible than in Nepal's cultural heritage. Kathmandu Valley's temples and palace squares are not museum pieces that can be lifted into storage. They are lived spaces woven into festivals, morning rituals, and daily worship. UNESCO has described the earthquake's damage to cultural heritage and the significance of gradual restoration, emphasizing both Nepal's vulnerability and the importance of preparedness and resilient recovery. To rebuild heritage is to rebuild identity. But it is also to make choices: which materials are authentic, which techniques are safe, what gets prioritized when time, money, and skilled labor are limited. In a country where sacred architecture is also public space, what does restoration truly mean? Bringing stones back to where they were, or helping a community find its footing again? While the earthquake represents sudden change, climate change represents the slow kind, the kind that is easy to ignore until the evidence becomes unavoidable. Across the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, scientific assessments have warned that under high-emission warming trajectories, the region could lose around 2/3 of its glaciers by 2100, with major implications for water systems and downstream communities. For Nepal, this isn't just about scenery. Glaciers and seasonal snow act like natural storage, releasing meltwater into rivers that people depend on for drinking water, irrigation, and hydropower. The fear is not a simple single outcome. It is a sequence-altered melt timing, unstable slopes, greater risks of floods from glacial lakes, and long-term stress on water reliability. This is where Nepal's modern story becomes wider than its borders. The Himalaya has often been called one of Asia's critical water towers in public discussions because what happens in high mountains does not stay in high mountains. When the ice changes, the calendar of rivers changes, and that can reshape farming seasons and energy planning far away from the peaks. Yet Nepal is not simply waiting helplessly. The modern era here is also filled with local ingenuity communities, adapting building techniques after earthquakes, conservation groups protecting threatened species, planners debating how to balance development with fragile terrain. The challenge is, scale adaptation is hardest, where the ground itself refuses stability. If the mountains are changing slowly and the earthquakes can change everything fast, how does a country plan for both at once? Then comes tourism, the modern force that can feel like a gift and a burden in the same breath. Everest, for many travelers, is the ultimate symbol, the highest point on Earth, a pilgrimage of endurance. But the Everest region has also become a global lesson in what overlove can do to a place. Educational reporting has documented long-standing concerns about trash and overcrowding on Everest, alongside efforts to control pollution such as the work of the Sagarmatha Pollution Control Committee (SPCC), founded in 1991 to help manage waste in the Khumbu region. UNESCO documentation on Sagarmatha National Park also points to waste management realities on the ground, including large quantities of garbage collected from disposal sites in the Everest region in recent years. The point is not to shame visitors. The point is to reveal the contradiction at the heart of modern travel. People come seeking purity, but arrival creates footprints, sometimes literal, sometimes ecological. In the Khumbu, solutions have included organized cleanup efforts, managed disposal sites, and policies aimed at reducing the burden of waste. And still, the question persists: what is the right number of people to bring to a sacred landscape, especially when local livelihoods depend on those visitors? Meanwhile, beyond Everest, Nepal's cultural life remains vivid and stubbornly alive. Kathmandu's streets still swell during festivals. Stupas still gather devotees. Mountain villages still mark seasons with rituals tied to weather and harvest. Modern Nepal is not a country frozen in postcard imagery. It is a place where smartphones exist beside prayer wheels, where new roads meet old footpaths, where a single valley can hold centuries of art and a decade of reconstruction scaffolding. So the modern chapter is not a simple problem and solution arc. It is a balancing act performed every day. Rebuilding after a disaster without turning heritage into a theme park. Protecting high mountains from the side effects of admiration, and preparing for a climate future that may rewrite the rivers not with one dramatic shock, but with a quiet, relentless drift. If Nepal's greatest strength has always been adaptation, then what happens when the pace of change finally outruns the traditions designed to survive it? Nepal is often described with superlatives: highest, steepest, most sacred, most extreme. But after traveling through its layers, a different truth begins to surface. Nepal is not defined only by what rises above the clouds. It is defined by what endures beneath them. This is a country shaped by collision continents pressing together mountains, lifting upward valleys, filling and draining rivers, cutting their own stubborn paths. And in the middle of that motion, people built something astonishing: pilgrimage routes and palace squares, living temples and mountain communities, lowland forests where rare animals still breathe, and high ridges where life survives on almost nothing. But Nepal's beauty has never been risk-free. The 2015 earthquake, proved how quickly the ground can change a nation's future. And the glaciers and snowfields of the Hindu Kush Himalaya remind us that the slow changes may be even more consequential because they reshape water seasons and security for far more people than those who ever stand near the summits. Add to that the pressure of tourism, especially in iconic areas like Everest, and the question becomes not whether Nepal will change, but how it will choose to change. So the call to action is simple, but not easy. If you visit Nepal, travel with humility, follow local guidance, respect sacred spaces, reduce waste, and support community-based services that keep both culture and ecosystems alive. If you never visit, you still have a role, because what happens to the Himalaya is tied to global climate choices and to the stories we choose to value and protect. On a map, the edge of the world looks like a thin line. In Nepal, it feels like a question carved into stone and carried by wind. If the earth is still rising here, what are we rising toward? And what will we leave behind?